Okay, I think everyone's in now. Since I don't see anyone who's new, we will start today's study with just a shorter context. We will only look at the immediate context of chapter 14. Last week, we studied the first part of chapter 14, that is verses. Oh, by the way, you can all see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So last week we looked at chapter 14, the first 23 verses. And before we proceed to cover the rest of chapter 14, let's just recap what we saw in the first part of chapter 14. The focus was on Jonathan, right? And we saw how Saul was increasingly being a failure as a king and as a leader. And so much so that earlier already God had said that Saul, you're rejected for certain reasons. We know what those reasons are: his lack of discipline, his disobedience, and his reliance on his own wisdom. And Samuel had also publicly denounced Saul as a king. And in this chapter, we also begin to see how the people at large, began to desert Saul, right? And however, God does not leave his people Israel without a leader. In Jonathan, he finds a willing instrument. And through the Jonathan and through the faith that Jonathan offers in God, God works the deliverance of his people over the Philistines. We saw how Jonathan truly loved the Lord, right? And his faith, and he had the strong faith that God will deliver, whether by few, whether they were few or whether they were many, God would deliver. And that faith was a faith that moved into action. So much so that he went up against the Philistines with just his armor bearer. And in the meanwhile, what was Saul doing? He and the army were dormant. They were defensive. They had retreated to Gibeah, which is Saul's hometown. And Saul was found sitting under a pomegranate tree. Whereas Jonathan, with just his armor bearer, in defiance of the probably Saul had not even ordered them to go out and engage the Philistines. Jonathan, of his own initiative, with just his armor bearer, had moved out and gone out to engage the Philistines. Jonathan ventured out fully knowing that he was going into hostile territory. He knew that he was entering difficult terrain, physical terrain. He knew that he was entering a challenge because the enemy was well entrenched and they were in a position of strength. And yet, we saw last time how he let the Lord determine his course of action. Every choice that seemed to be before Jonathan looked like bad choices, right? Any which way, by human wisdom, he could not win. Yet, Jonathan said he trusted the Lord to allow that the Lord would help him prevail over his enemy. So he said, whatever the choice that God shows, it is going to lead to victory. And God took this faith that Jonathan offered, and in a small battle of half-acre size, Jonathan and his armor bearer, two people, God took their faith and they won over 20 people, right? So 10 times the power. God multiplied the power of Jonathan's faith by 10 times, not just 10 times. He even extended its impact over a larger area, not just that half acre where the battle took place with Jonathan, but over the entire place where the Philistines were entrenched, in their camp, wherever they were, wherever they had gone out to raid the Israelites. In all these places, not just the 20 people whom Jonathan engaged, but the entire army was thrown into terror by God's spiritual intervention. And such was the multiplication of the effect of Jonathan's faith that the Israelites were left in no doubt that God had intervened on their behalf, and their faith was restored. So we saw last time how the little faith, the little actions that Jonathan took in his great faith, I shouldn't say little faith, the small actions he took in his faith, how it was multiplied and resulted in a great deliverance of the people, right? And restoration of Israel's courage and faith. That's what we saw so far. This time, our attention will shift to Saul. Okay, so the second part, we will take a deeper look at Saul. We will look at two oaths that Saul takes. One, that he takes and imposes on all the Israelites, right? And he puts them in a situation of weakness and fallibility. And the second oath he takes which threatens the life of his son Jonathan. We will examine why these oaths were clearly wrong. There is no doubt that these oaths were wrong. We will look at why they were wrong. They were wrong in its motivation, and they were wrong in the impact that resulted from it, or the possible impact that it could cause, right? We will also study the contrasting impact of these two rash oaths on Israel. One leads them to sin, and the other leads them to see God's purpose more clearly. One makes them fall, and the other makes them to stand up and see the fallibility of Saul and why Saul is not God's chosen king any longer. We will also look at why Saul is such an enigma, right? In this chapter, he starts off so well, but he ends so poorly. In this chapter, we will look at why is it that Saul had such a limited and a gradually reducing effectiveness as a king, right? So Jonathan, a man of faith, initiates a great victory, but Saul, a man of pride, limited the extent of that victory, even though he tried to extend it. Okay, so that's what we will see in the rest of our study. So with that, we will look at the first few verses. The first section of our study will be on verses 24 to 35. This is Saul's first oath. We saw earlier how Jonathan had become a channel of God's deliverance for the Israelites. And as a result, Saul and the Israelites had now revived in strength, and they were chasing down the Philistines. And we see Saul trying to reestablish now his role as a king. He's trying to reestablish his authority. And in this portion, he starts off with Saul actually trying to chase down the Philistines and eliminate them fully. He's trying to reestablish his position as a leader of the people. The question we have to ask is, do the methods that Saul employs actually have a spiritual, does it pass the spiritual test of accountability to the Lord? So the question that we have to look at is, what was wrong with the oath? So Saul had a mission that was to chase down and eliminate the Israelites. He wanted his army to do that, but he uses a certain method. He puts on them, he imposes on them a certain oath that they should not have any food. They should fast until this mission comes to pass. So the question is, what was wrong with the oath that Saul imposed upon the Israelite army, and what was its impact, right? So on a side note, we'll not explore this very deep, but I hope you have had time to look at some other oaths also, which were close in our study. One was in Judges, which we studied a couple of months back, and the other was something that we studied a few weeks back, Hannah's oath, right? So there were two other oaths, and we saw the consequences of that. So this is the third instance of where we're going to study an oath and why some oaths are not the right oaths to take. Okay, so I'll leave you with that question. What was wrong with the oath that Saul imposed upon the Israelite army, and what was its impact? Okay, so let's get into this question. So first is, what was wrong with the oath that Saul imposed upon the Israelite army? What can we read about Saul here, right? Saul has an improper view of his role as a king and his accountability before God, right? We have seen that. We have seen that earlier, and we are seeing that now. Why do we say that? Because he has a distorted sense of purpose, correct? Contrast Saul's purpose for putting the oath on the people to how Jonathan spiritually perceived the battle. Both are fighting the same battle, right? As a pioneer and a leader, in last week, we saw how Jonathan saw the true nature of the battle. He saw that the battle was against the uncircumcised Philistines. He was battling God's enemies, and it was God's battle, right? As a king, Saul saw the Philistines as his personal enemies. A lot of you brought that out, right? And who had humiliated him. So I think we can see Saul has this urge to portray himself. There's a sense of pride, right? We will see it later also. He does not like somebody else having credit. Even his son, Jonathan, probably he knows what Jonathan has done, and he doesn't like Jonathan sharing the credit. We saw it earlier when this battle was triggered. Jonathan had actually catalyzed, had precipitated the crisis against the Philistines, and Saul took the credit for that. Right at the beginning, we saw that. So even here, so those characteristics are coming out. So he sees that he has to restore his pride, his standing before his people. And so he also senses that the Philistines had humiliated him. He was humiliated in a way. And so now he sees this as a personal battle, right? Then second, we see that Saul's faith was shallow. And because his faith was shallow, it could not motivate his army. Therefore, he has to drive his army by fear. Contrast how Jonathan motivated his armor bearer, right? Jonathan motivated his armor bearer as a faith leader. He shares his faith with his armor bearer, and that is enough to motivate and strengthen him. We see that in verses 6 to 10 last time, how he shared why we are doing this. We are engaging in a battle against the uncircumcised Philistines. I know we are going against a strategically entrenched and a stronger enemy. So much so that the armor bearer says, I will follow you. Okay, you do as your mind tells you, as your heart calls you to, and I'm right behind you. I'm all the way, I'm with you, right? So we saw how Jonathan's faith was transparent and evident to his armor bearer, and that motivated his armor bearer to strengthen. So his armor bearer was a source of strength to Jonathan, whereas Saul's faith was so shallow that he has to exploit his authority as a king. He has to use his authority as a king and instill fear on his people to drive them to battle. It's almost like somebody chasing behind the soldiers saying, I'm going to whip you. Like how these ships of old were rowed by those who have seen the Ben-Hur movie and all, are rowed by the captives, right? By the prisoners. And they are driven by whipping, right? So Saul is in a way doing this. He has to. So, but what is the result of that? Jonathan's faith motivated and strengthened his armor bearer, whereas Saul's shallow faith and his method ends up weakening his people, right? We also see that Saul's decision was self-centered. And because it was self-centered, not centered on God, he did not share God's vision. His vision was clouded. It was clouded, and he did not see the provision that God had made for this mission success. Contrast this with Jonathan's clarity of mission. I will explain what I mean by this. Blessy, yeah? You wanted to say something, Blessy?
Yeah, just one point that I observed. Yeah, just one point I want to say. I just want to note this one verse that I just went through. It said that after Jonathan takes this, what is
Honey.
it, honey, and he said, look now, my countenance has brightened because I've tasted little honey. So that shows, how desperate and weak the army was, and taking such a decision would be how much more detrimental to the army and its,
Saul's decision was.
offense here.
Yes, exactly. Second thing is, Saul doesn't seem to be on the battleground, right? I suspect he's still under the pomegranate tree, or at least figuratively, in Gibeah. Whereas Jonathan is there, right in the midst. Jonathan knows what his people are experiencing. And Jonathan, because he's there, he's seeing the Lord's provision. You enter the forest, it's like the manna, right? The picture of the manna on the ground. It was there on the ground. The Lord had placed it there for them to eat in the desert. And the honey was on the ground, it says. So Jonathan sees the Lord's provision. He tastes it and he sees it that the Lord is good, and he's strengthened by it, right? Jonathan also has a clarity of vision to see that Saul is foolish, right? When he's called, when attention is called to Jonathan as soon as he eats the honey, and someone tells him, hey, you shouldn't be doing this because Saul had put us under an oath, which Jonathan is unaware of. So everything points to Saul is nowhere on the scene. He's just put his authority on the people and send them out. So, but Jonathan's vision is clear. His faith in God and his ability to share God's vision gives him a clear sight, and he recognizes the greater purpose of the battle, and he recognizes that the honey on the ground, the provisions that the enemies as they are fleeing have abandoned, are things that God has sent so that his army could be strengthened, so that they could achieve a more comprehensive victory. So Jonathan sees what Saul does not, right? So Saul, what does he see? He sees only his desired end. He wants vengeance on the enemy who has humiliated him. He's blind to the needs of those who were to work for it to happen. And we see that God also, when he calls you out to a mission, right? He is not blind to your needs. He provides all your needs. When he led the people through the desert, he provided for all their needs. So Saul is clearly not modeling God, right? So clearly his mission, clearly his vision, and his desires are not what God is, not in alignment with God. And Saul is blind to the real reason why the Philistines are in retreat. They're chasing the Philistines now, right? Because he doesn't even know that this whole thing is happening because it is caused by God, Jonathan's faith. It is a blessing that God has taken Jonathan's faith and blessed it. So Saul is even blind to this. So many things. Because he's so self-centered, his vision is not clear. He's not able to see a lot of things that Jonathan sees. He's not able to see that God is providing. He's not able to see the actual need, the reason for the battle. He's not able to see why the Philistines are retreating. So many things are wrong. So Saul's motivation is wrong. Saul's intent is wrong, and Saul is in the wrong place, right? And then what's the impact of the oath? The soldiers already weakened and famished, right? And because they held to this oath, they are under, like, the oath is a serious thing then, right? To violate an oath was a serious offense. So when they finished what they saw was the battle, they rushed to eat. They had to just satisfy this hunger that was killing them more than the battle. And in the process, they could not wait. So they ate the meat, they slaughtered the meat and they ate it without, while the blood was still in it, thereby falling into sin, right? So we can see that Saul's folly has actually led his people into sin. So that is something that a leader always must be aware of. You can lead people into sin. Saul is not unaware. When he comes to know of what is happening, we see that Saul is actually doing all of this not because he's totally unaware or insensitive to the Lord's laws. But the problem is, for Saul, the Lord's laws and everything has only ritualistic and legalistic importance, like how Santosh mentioned. So he's quick to judge. He says, he's quick to see the error, that they have broken the Lord's law, but he's quick to judge the people and he shifts the blame. He says, all of you, if you read verse 33, have broken the covenant. What about me? He's out of the picture. He's sitting outside and judging, okay? Which leaves us with some open questions. Does Saul deliberately avoid taking responsibility for his decisions? We have seen this many times, right? Whenever he does something wrong, he blames something else. He blames Samuel for being late. He blames the people for deserting him when he takes on the role of a priest. Now he's blaming the people for breaking the covenant, though he's actually the root cause of the problem, right? So the question is he deliberately avoiding taking responsibility for his decision? Or is his wisdom so less that he cannot see that he's the root cause of the people's sin? The second question for us is an open question is, we see that this portion ends with Saul building an altar. Now, even that act of building the altar is called into question, right? Does Saul build this altar as an expression of his gratitude for the victory that the Lord has given him over the Philistines? Or is it another legalistic way of making amends for the violation of God's law when the people ate the meat with the blood in it? So these are some questions. So Saul, even when he seems to do things that are right, his motivation is questionable. We wonder, why is he doing this? So we look a little more at these aspects in the last part of our study today. But let's move on to the next portion, which is verses 36 to 46. This focuses on the second oath that Saul takes. Okay. So the first oath Saul took was when things seemed to be going right for him. Philistines were fleeing. The second oath he takes when things suddenly begin to go wrong for him. Okay. So Saul now makes a decision that he wants to eliminate the Philistines at night. He wants to attack them and eliminate them. And Ahijah, who's his priest, probably it was Ahijah, though he's not mentioned, because we know the priest earlier was mentioned, right? Ahijah tells him, don't you think it is right that we should first consult the Lord and see whether this is what we should do? So belated advice, but Saul decides to take the advice, right? So, but when he takes the advice, we see that God does not respond to his to the question that he has. When Saul asks, should I go out after the Philistines, he does not get an answer. So when he is not answered by God, we see Saul again falling back on his earlier problem. So he has this continuous conflict between himself and God, right? And he's falling back on this earlier characteristic, and he takes a second oath. So let's examine this. Why do you think Saul feels compelled to take the second oath? This is the oath that even if it's my son Jonathan who has done wrong, I will not hesitate to put the person who did wrong to death. Okay? So, but this oath and the impact of this oath has a larger effect than the first one, right? It has a wider and a more sweeping effect. So the two questions is, what do you think Saul felt compelled to take the oath? Why do you think Saul felt compelled to take the second oath? And what was the result of Saul's second oath on his people? One thing to note was, I've just put it in the note, right? Sometimes it's very interesting to look, how do you identify different sections of the scripture? Look at how it's bracketed. So there is see, in the original Hebrew text, there is no numbering of verses or anything. It's all one big flow. But calling out, the subtitles we see in our Bibles comes out because of the way it is structured. So verse 36, which is the beginning of the section, starts with, Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them till the morning light. Let us not leave a man of them. And 46 brings up the conclusion. Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines. So he's given up and the Philistines have gone their own way. So between them, between that original statement of the mission and the conclusion in verse 46 is what transpires, which is what we have to examine for the second question. Okay, so I'll leave you with that question. Why do you think Saul felt compelled to take the second oath? What is the result? Let's just look at, I just put together some thoughts. Some of what I said came out of what we discussed now. So Saul's mission, what was it? He wanted to decisively defeat and eliminate the Philistines by night. Sounds very good. Sounds to be in alignment with what God would want, right? Because the Philistines aren't not people of the covenant, they had to be eliminated. Compare the response of the people to Saul's plan with the response Jonathan gets from his armor bearer. So Saul has his mission, which seems to be right. Saul's people replied, do whatever seems best to you. Very unmotivated, very resigned and lethargic response. When Jonathan revealed his plan to the armor bearer earlier last week, his armor bearer said to him, do everything that is on your mind. Do as you're inclined. I am with you all the way. Very motivated and encouraging response. Okay. Saul seeks God's counsel only very late because somebody else reminded him. And God does not answer it. So, like we said, as soon as he does not get the answer, he wants to shift the blame elsewhere. He says, like, this is still not because I'm doing something wrong. It's probably because somebody else has done something wrong. So he's blind to the folly of his first oath. Instead, he is equating his will. Like he sees, I'm asking God, and God would normally answer me. He says, my oath was God's will. He's equating his will with God's. And he says, if somebody broke my oath, it is because they broke God's will. So he sees a lack of response from God as an expression of God's displeasure for someone breaking Saul's oath. So in a way, if you see, he thinks he's very self-righteous, like Santosh said. He's placing himself on a pedestal, right? And perhaps because Saul senses his inability to motivate his people and win their trust, he makes a second oath. So we know he's very insecure, right? And so his second oath proved that he was in right standing before God. Again, it's an exercise in self-advertisement, in self-positioning before his people. He says, all you leaders of the army, come here. Find out how the sin occurred today. I'm not answered because somebody has sinned. For surely as the Lord, the deliverer of Israel, lives. Note those words. For surely as the Lord, the deliverer of Israel, lives. Because these words are quoted back to him by the people. Even if it turns out to be my own son, Jonathan, he will certainly die. So is it because he's saying that is how righteous I am, how faithful I am to the Lord's will? Or is it because he says that this is my thing. I think this is because of Jonathan. And even if it's Jonathan, and if it's proven, because he puts a test where he uses the Urim and the Thummim, and that's a test supposed to demonstrate God's will. So he's saying that even if it's Jonathan, he will certainly die, right? Let's just pause for a moment and see, at this point, what might be the impressions the Israelites have developed of Saul, right? They have already in Saul a leader who does not have the conviction of faith to act against his challenges. They have seen Saul retreat into Gibeah and sitting under the pomegranate tree while the Philistines were raiding the people. So that 600 who stayed with him were probably the most brave warriors, and they did not see inspirational leadership from Saul. Right? That is one impression they had. They did not see a leader who provided for their need. Instead, they saw that he drove them to battle, ignoring their physical needs. There is a question, was Saul in the battle at all, or was he still working from home in Gibeah? Was he still under the pomegranate tree? We know that Jonathan was working on the battlefield, right? So again, the people are beginning to form impressions of Saul and relative impressions of Jonathan. Then they do not see in Saul a leader who takes responsibility for his decisions. Instead, they're continuously seeing, first he has shifted the blame onto them whenever they sinned against the law. So now they're already conditioned to know that Saul is a person who shifts responsibilities. Okay. Next, they do not have confidence in Saul or share his passion for his mission. You see that in verse 40, like Gifty pointed out, right? Like Blessy pointed out, they had a very lethargic reaction when Saul entrusted them with this mission of eliminating the Philistines. They said, do as you please, right? And in Saul's second oath, the people clearly see now that Saul is only trying to be legalistically and ritualistically right with God. So they're seeing through the hypocrisy. They expose Saul's hypocrisy. Saul has now lost the confidence of his people. He had lost the confidence of God. He had lost the confidence of Samuel. He had lost the confidence of his son. And now he loses the confidence of his people, right? So because they question him in verse 45, when the Lord's point that Jonathan is the one who violated the oath. So God allowed the Lords to point to Jonathan because he knew what was going to happen, right? So God can see through this, see ahead of this. So the people now stand up and they ask, should Jonathan, we know it was he who was responsible for this victory that we have today. Why should he die? May it never be. Remember what Saul told them? As surely as the Lord lives, if Jonathan has done wrong, I will see that he is put to death. So they're quoting back to him and says, as surely as the Lord lives, not a single hair on Jonathan's head will fall to the ground. For it is with the help of God that he has acted today. So the people are now standing up to, he has lost the confidence of the people. And how does this section end? Remember the way it started? He had a mission to eliminate the Philistines. It ends with us being told that Saul has now lost sight of his mission. Because we are told Saul has now stopped chasing the Philistines and the Philistines went back home, right? So with that, let's get to the last part of our study, which is verses 45 to 52. So this is contrasting to the earlier two sections where we studied two situations clearly. This is like a summary of Saul's kingship, right? So let's look at this passage to see what we can summarize about Saul. Was he a complete success or was he a limited success? Right? Why was he a limited success? It's not that he was entirely a failure, but his success was limited and gradually his effectiveness reduced. In this passage, there are two clues to what is happening. One is, look at what happens to his lifelong campaign against the Philistines. We know that in his campaign against the Philistines, he was aligned with God because they were not the people of the covenant, but the result of his campaign is there is no victory, sustained victory. The Philistines continue to thrive. So in Saul's life, the Philistines are always alive, right? And the second is his method of recruitment of soldiers into the army, because there's a nice little note there, how he recruits people into his army. Both of these point to something. It tells us why Saul had limited effectiveness as a king. If you're interested why I'm pointing to the recruitment of soldiers, just look back on 1 Samuel 10, 23 to 26. This is the place where Samuel crowns in public view. He puts Saul on the throne. And then we know some people objected and they said, is this man going to lead us? And we were told that some brave people were so touched by the Lord that they followed Saul, right? So his first soldiers were people who followed him because the Lord touched them, right? And the new ones are conscripts that Saul actually draws in, right? So the question before us is, we'll quickly deal with this, is why was Saul's effectiveness limited? Let's just get into this portion. We know that Saul's effectiveness was a gradual process. He started well, but ended poorly. He started well. He was chosen by God. He was anointed by Samuel. Yes, God gave him a new heart, we are told. He was instructed and mentored by Samuel. He was affirmed by the Lord through signs. He was filled with the Holy Spirit to prophesy and lead the people in the battle against the Ammonites. So everything seems to be going well. He started well, but he finishes poorly. And what happens? Why does it happen? Because of his obedience, lack of discipline, self-centeredness, inability to take responsibility for his actions. And because of all of this, he loses favor with God, Samuel, his son Jonathan, and even the people. So the summary statement of Saul's kingship is, there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. So Saul is always going to be battling the Philistines in his life. So take this as a metaphor also, if you may, right? He's always going to be battling the Philistines in his life. He's never going to get rid of the enemies in his life, and the enemy is within him, right? It's also representative of his life in general. I just said that. So the big question is, who or what is Saul's biggest enemy? See, he's an enigma, right? In the face of so much personal evidence, a person who has had so much personal evidence of God and God's provision is still unable to submit to God's will. Can it be that he does not truly believe in God's love and grace? Right? Why is it that he is not able to submit to God's will? What comes in the way of Saul internalizing that God first loved him, right? And that God can only have plans to prosper him and not to harm him. We know all of this is true of God from the scripture, right? Why is it that Saul cannot internalize this? It's while thinking of this that I was actually just thinking, right? See, the essence of grace is love, is God's grace in action. I'm sorry, grace is God's love in action. And the essence of grace is, and this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer brings it out so beautifully, right? So the essence of grace is that the account has been paid in advance. Because it has been paid, everything that comes from grace can be had for nothing. You don't have to pay a price because the price is already paid. So since the cost was infinite, the possibilities of using it and the benefits of grace is infinite. So is grace cheap? Bonhoeffer goes on to say that grace is not cheap, it's costly. It is costly because of what it does, because of why grace is provided, what it meant for that grace to be available to us, and because of what it means for us, right? It's costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ, right? It is costly because it can cost your life. And it is grace, it's freely given because it's the only thing. It is grace because it's the only thing that gives you true life, right? I just love the last paragraph. Above all, grace is costly because it cost God the life of his son. You have bought, we are told, at a great price. And what has cost God so much cannot be cheap for us, right? Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his son too dear a price to pay for our life, but he delivered him for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God. Christ on the cross is a picture of costly grace. So the grace that we experience is not cheap. And it is evidence that God loved us. And that's why he wants us to love him. That's why we are called to follow him. And that's something that Saul was clearly missing, right? For some reason, Saul was not able to internalize this and to allow the fact that God loved him to actually dictate the course of his life. Which brings us to the last question, which is our question for the group discussion, for the breakout discussion. When is it that we find it most difficult to yield control of our life and our plans to God's control? Is it when things are going right, or is it when it's going wrong? We see both these situations in the study today, right? In summary, we know that salt could not yield control. So the question for us is, in our own lives, is there a touch of salt sometimes? When is it that we find it difficult to yield control? Is it when things are going right for us, or is it when things are going wrong for us? And why? Okay, so I think we can conclude today's lesson. I just leave you with this 1 John 4:16-19. I won't read it because I'll be sharing this notes with you. Next study will be 1 Samuel 15 on 14th March.